Hi, today we're going to be talking about absolute phrases, which are parts of the sentence that can describe the sentence in which they appear. In this case, specifically the subject of our sentence. And that's a lot like a participial phrase or prepositional phrase, because those also describe other parts of the sentence, but absolute phrases are constructed in slightly different ways, and they have some unique properties that work really well in adding description and imagery to our sentences. Okay, so they're almost complete sentences by themselves. As a test, and this will always work for any absolute phrase, you can make an absolute phrase a sentence by adding was or were. So that's a great test, and in this case it's very convenient because this will always work. Okay. Now let's take a look at some sentences that don't have an absolute phrase in them, but could be improved quite a bit by using an absolute phrase. And we're going to talk about how we can do that in just a second. So in this first sentence, we see his hand was raw. He reached a place at the top. Now, these sentences are very disconnected. The ideas in them are, they're obviously connected because they're right next to each other, but we don't get a sense that they're happening maybe at the same time or that they describe one another, right? They're separated by these periods. And if you take a look at the second sentence, there's nothing wrong with this. It is a complete sentence, but it's very plain and not very descriptive, which is not very interesting writing, and it's not great for us as the reader, right? She returned to her bench. There's just not a whole lot going on in that sentence, so it can be greatly improved by adding some additional information, right? And we can do that using an absolute phrase. So in this first sentence, I've changed his hand was raw to an absolute phrase by removing was. I've replaced the period with a comma, and now the sentence has a very different meaning. His hand raw, he reached a place at the top. So we can get a sense by using this absolute phrase that we can see it like a movie. I think that's its best quality, is that it's almost like the camera starts zoomed in on his hand, right? We can see his hand, maybe it's bleeding, it's painful, right? And then it zooms out and it gives us a sense he reached a place at the top. So now we can see that he's reached the top of some cliff or something like that. And the writing sort of moves us along that way. It's very, very nice, very good writing. In the second sentence, we see how that plain, not complicated sentence has become something much more rich and vivid. She returned to her bench, comma, her face showing all the unhappiness that had suddenly overtaken her. So in this case, we start out with the camera panned out, right? And then we can sort of see the camera moving into her face and showing us all of that emotion that we were missing from that first sentence, right? Because it just wasn't there. So that's another way that we can use an absolute phrase to add a lot of description to our writing, okay? So in its simplest form, an absolute phrase is just a noun followed by a participle. A participle could be present tense or past tense, like we've talked about in the past, okay? The noun can be modified by something like his or her. That gives us a greater sense of connection to the subject, right? But it doesn't have to be. It could be something as simple as arms swinging or legs pumping. They can be very simple, but they can also be very complicated, and it just depends on how much detail you want to give us and what you're going for as the writer, okay? So anything after the participle is optional, but it can be used to add a lot of detail and richness of information here. Now, it's also important that you remember, depending on where you're using the absolute phrase, you need to use a comma to connect it to our independent clause. So it could come before or after the absolute phrase, depending on where you use it, okay? Now, you have some sentences to practice on that you need to bring to class for next time. Go back, watch any parts of this video if you have any other questions, and bring your questions to class with you next time. We'll talk more about this and practice with this idea some more when we meet next time. Good luck.